Welcome to Evangelical-ish, where we discuss the good, the bad, and the ugly of the American evangelical church, deconstruction, faith, and God's love through it all. Remember, if you're listening to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, or any of your favorite podcast platforms, let us invite you to join the live interactive recording most Wednesday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific on the Evangelical-ish YouTube channel. Now to this episode of Evangelical-ish. Yes, and we say most Wednesday night. We are recording
some Wednesday nights now.
Yes, it is early Wednesday morning as we record the live stream for this, or as we live stream the recording of this podcast out here on the West Coast. But here we are, glad to be together for another episode of Evangelical-ish. I am Paul.
And I'm April.
You forgot that we do that part.
I know.
Happy Wednesday morning. And I know for some of you, the Wednesday nights have become a real interaction time, but as we are working on life and doing all the things, and April has a new book, and we're working on all these things, we've just found that it may be helpful for us to be able to move around from time to time. So hopefully people can find us, as our friend Guy from Canada has done already here in the live stream. So
what's up, brother? Is that what that means? The special teams.
What's up, brother?
I don't know if that's what he means, but what's up, brother? Anyway, okay, moving on.
Okay, cool. Well, good morning, April.
Good morning. Yeah, it is morning. Wow. I think it's the earliest we've ever gone live.
I think so.
I still have a spark of life in me.
Yes. Well, in the comments, Johnny Nine Fingers says this time has allowed him to finally get to be here for a live. So see, it's advantageous for some others.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I am super excited about our guests. We're going to jump
Me too.
Right into it because I think this topic is so important. So let's welcome Dan Hummel. Welcome, Dan.
Hello.
I'm going to give a brief little bio for you, though. Daniel G. Hummel is the director of the Lumen Center in Madison, Wisconsin, and a research fellow in the history department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He received his PhD in American history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and has been a research fellow at the Institute for Research in the Humanities and the Harvard Kennedy School at Harvard University. And he has authored 2 books. The first one, Covenant Brothers, Evangelicals, Jews, and U.S.-Israel Relations, and The Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism, How the Evangelical Battle over the End Times Shaped a Nation. All of those topics I feel are so relevant to our current day, and probably for a long time, but it seems very relevant today. Anyway, welcome, Dan. I'm so glad to have you.
It's good to be with you. And yeah, when you're a historian, you're really not trying to anticipate the market on these things, like what's going to be the hot topic, 10 years from now when I finally finish this book. But it's worked out that both dispensationalism and Christian Zionism continue to be, unfortunately, in many cases, relevant to.
I feel like, would you agree that I think most Christians or evangelicals that espouse Christian Zionism, I don't know that they would call themselves Christian Zionists. Do you think that's fair?
I actually, that's a good question. Certainly there's millions of evangelicals who feel warmly toward Israel, who might even vote with Israel in mind, who wouldn't call themselves Christian Zionists. I don't think the term has a bad rap within the evangelical world, though. I think it was a term that actually isn't that old. It really came about in the 1970s, and it was coined as a badge of honor. It was Christians who were so supportive of Israel that they basically got to be, inducted into the Zionist Hall of Fame, you could say. And so there's a somewhat of a pride around that, though. There is debate within the world of Christian Zionism if Christian is the right term or if biblical Zionism. That's sort of another term people use. But I think for a lot of sectors of our culture today, Zionism can be a really polarizing term. It can bring with it baggage. Within evangelical circles, that's not the case. It really does signal sort of conservative theology, conservative politics, and other things.
Can you just define Zionism for us so we make sure we're all understanding the same word? And then, and how is the Christian version a little bit different than just any regular Zionism, I guess?
Yeah, so Zionism, sort of as a dictionary definition, would be the belief that there should be a state for the Jewish people, and that state be located in the historic biblical lands associated with ancient Israel. And the Christian part of that is so a Christian Zionist is someone who would believe that, but would use Christian theological and historical arguments to make the case for why that should be. And that would separate them from Jewish Zionists or other Zionists who would not, invoke Christian theology or Christian readings of the Bible, would invoke something else. But that's what would separate a Christian Zionist from another type of Zionist.
And we should note, not all Jews are Zionists. Is that correct?
Oh, that's definitely true, and historically, that's been even more true in a sense. Judaism today, or the Jewish world today, is actually more, you could say, united around Zionism than it was in 1948 when the State of Israel was founded. So yeah, this is a hot topic within the Jewish world, just as it is within the Christian world.
So give us some history. Like what's the theology around Christian Zionism? Why are there evangelicals that espouse this ideology? And then we can, get to what's going on currently too.
Right. So historically, Christian Zionism is something that is sort of the purview of just a very small group of Christians until about the 19th century. And so going all the way back, you can find different church fathers even, but certainly by the Middle Ages, you can find, this sort of anomalous monk here, or this theologian in the early Reformation there, who talks about expecting the Jewish people to return to their covenanted land as described in the Bible, and that this is somehow part of God's plan for redeeming the world. And so it's not an entirely new belief system. However, by the 19th century, you start getting a lot of momentum and a lot of broadening of who believes in this to not just a few here or there Christians, but a movement, you could say, at least a proto-movement of Christians. And it coincides with the growth of Jewish Zionism, or political Zionism, around Theodor Herzl, who was the founder of political Zionism in the late 19th century. And here you start getting Christians really linking up readings of the Bible, particularly literalistic readings of the prophecy parts of the Bible, with an analysis of the modern world, of the failure of Christians to evangelize and convert the Jewish people en masse. And you start getting a sort of hodgepodge that also includes some humanitarian concerns about anti-Semitism and Jewish pogroms in Europe in the late 19th century, particularly in Russia. And that all sort of leads to a growing Christian interest in supporting the Zionist movement that picks up even more steam after World War I, and the Balfour Declaration by the British Empire, which uses the British Empire's authority to basically promise part of Palestine to the Jewish people as a national home. And then you start seeing the just rapid increase in anti-Semitism in Europe. And a lot of Christian activists are connecting the dots and encouraging Jewish migration to Palestine as part of the solution to European anti-Semitism. And that's where on the American side, you start seeing groups like the American Christian Palestine Committee emerge. Now, a group like that's a group from the 1930s and 1940s. There are not many, you could say, evangelicals or fundamentalists that are part of that group. That's actually led by more progressive or liberal Protestant leaders. People like Reinhold Niebuhr were very concerned for humanitarian reasons about the plight of Jews during the 1920s and 1930s. But you do have a lot of, you could say, on the sideline, fundamentalists and evangelicals being interested in this and really taking note and seeing this as somehow fulfilling biblical prophecy. And then it's really 1948 and the founding of the State of Israel, where you start seeing the gleanings of a more modern situation like we have today, where there are millions of evangelicals, millions of Christians in the United States who see Israel as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy, the State of Israel, who see supporting Israel as something that the United States is called to do for a variety of reasons, but one of them particularly being a sort of blessing theology that God will bless the United States if the United States supports Israel. And these become sort of the backbone of modern Christian Zionism, but they are really, I mean, in the long span of things, they're quite recent developments. It's not like you can go back to even the early Reformation period, so the 15th or 16th century. You don't really see these types of concerns by Christians. What you do see when it comes to the Jewish people is a strong desire to evangelize to Jews, to convert them to Christianity, and a lot of what we might call today anti-Judaism. It's less race-based anti-Semitism, and it's more theological-based, contrasting the universality and grace of Christianity versus the particularism and law of Judaism. That's a very long Christian tradition that has, up until the 19th century, really dominated how Christians and Jews have, or certainly how Christians have thought about Jews. But the situation today, I guess, just to tie it up, is quite new and different, and really only dates back a few decades. Even though it can feel like this has been a permanent state of affairs.
So what would you? Oh, go ahead.
It just feels like such a dichotomy that Christians believe the founding of the nation of Israel and the rebirth of Israel will hasten the return of Jesus. So then he will fight against everybody that isn't a Christian, including Jews. It feels like a dichotomous belief system.
It's a complicated one for sure, and I haven't mentioned this term yet, but it's in the title of my second book. There's a particular theological tradition called Dispensationalism that emerges in the 19th century that has a very distinct way of reading the Bible, and this is how dispensationalists would say it. Their reading of the Bible, creates a certain set of theological commitments, and those theological commitments do seem to the outsider to be contradictory, or at least not all flowing in the same direction in terms of what you should do and what you should expect. But they would insist that their reading, they would say they're just following the Bible, but that their reading of the Bible does have God resuming the redemption of the world through the state of Israel after this teaching they have, which is called the rapture, which is when all the Christians leave earth and go into heaven. And so God will be working with Israel, but Israel is destined to a time of great tribulation and trouble. And they connect different prophecies from the Old Testament and Book of Revelation. This is often called the time of Jacob's trouble. That's a reference in the book of Jeremiah. And so, Israel is God's covenanted people, but they are going to be put through the ringer during this end times period, and will ultimately suffer great death. Now, everyone on earth is suffering massively during that time, so it's not like Jews are much different on that front. But this has often been a point of contention between Christians and Jews, particularly evangelicals and Jews, when they've tried to work together on Israel or on other issues. There's always this concern, particularly on the part of Jewish partners, of what are the real motives here? What is actually animating evangelical support for Israel? And we can get into. I think there's actually been a lot of refining of that as Christian Zionism has professionalized and basically become an organized lobby in the United States. There's been a lot of smoothing out of some of the more rougher ways that this relationship has been articulated. But certainly historically, that question of, are Christians just supporting Israel because they're actually working to the destruction of Israel, but accomplishing their own sort of theological goals? Or are they just supporting Israel so that they can evangelize to Jewish people and try to get some of them to convert to Christianity? These have always been in the background of the relationship, and have needed to be managed over time so that the relationship can continue and have productive, in their terms, outcomes. And there has been a lot of productive outcomes, so they have managed those things quite well, but these are always lingering in the background.
Yeah, because I would imagine that, Jewish Zionism and then Christian Zionism, the initial goal of Israel having all the land is comparable. That's the same. But the reasons, I grew up, I would not have called myself a Christian Zionist, but I was definitely taught that Israel has to control all of the land, and then Jesus can come back, which is the rapture that will start the Great Tribulation. And I don't know if you have heard this in your research, but I was taught that the 144,000 that it mentions in Revelation, that those would be Jews that convert to Christianity and are saved, quote unquote, salvation wise, but doesn't necessarily mean they don't, they probably die with everybody else in the world.
Yes, so that would be a dispensationalist at least dispensations influenced
Yeah.
reading of the 144,000. Yeah, I mean, this is the world that you're getting into with this, is like those numbers, which are referenced, one time in the book of Revelation, take on these sort of historic, literal space-time dimensions. And so you're having to fit in like all of these numbers and sequencing of events in Revelation, which is, essentially a series of visions that John of Patmos is having. But you're taking them as essentially like journalistic accounts of what's going on. And so it creates it creates sort of a logical problem, or a sequencing problem, a linear problem, that leads to a lot of piecing together and pulling in, a reference from Daniel 9, and then Jeremiah 30, and then Revelation 15, and having to like fit all those things together. And it makes sense if you're on the inside. I mean, it makes sense in the sense that it's a rational process that's going on if you're within it. I think from the outside, it can often feel, one, like there's no actual logic to it, or the logic is so opaque that it doesn't make sense unless you're inducted into it. And two, there's not a lot of concern about like the ethics or the themes or the messages that this ultimate timeline is conveying. And that's something that's been, even other conservative Christians have critiqued dispensationalism and Christian Zionism for this, that the sequence of events, the expectations, there's often been a weird excitement around like nuclear war and other wars that can come out of this type of speculation. This doesn't feel like it's Christian in the same way that other traditions treat this type of thing, but it comes out of this commitment to read the Bible in a certain way and to organize it according to their precepts. And it can move you into some weird corners and weird ways of presenting yourself to outsiders.
Well, for sure. And I grew up, we knew Jesus was coming in 1988 because of a calculation from 1948 to 1988. And
right.
I don't think that happened in 1988. But part of the quandary is the temple has to be rebuilt. And there happens to be this other Islamic shrine there. And so talk about how that's a part of the tension of where we are today.
Right. So, just going back in history a little. So the biggest book to really popularize this to, you could say, outsiders to the church world was The Late Great Planet Earth, which was a book from the year 1970, written by Hal Lindsey.
Oh, yeah. We had it on the shelf right by the Bible. They were right there, the Bible and The Late Great Planet Earth.
Well, interesting. So David Ben-Gurion, who was the first prime minister of Israel, if you go to the museum in Israel, that is his house, basically, that he died in. This book is on his night table. So he died. I don't know if he was actually reading it, but it was on the stack. So, and he died in 1974, I believe, 1973. So I mean, it came out a few years before that. The best-selling nonfiction book of the 1970s in the United States. So just absolutely massive, reached way beyond the church world. And in Lindsey's book, he's writing this in 1969, 1970, right after the war in 1967, where Israel occupies, captures big chunks of historic biblical ancient Israel, and takes control of Jerusalem in particular. Lindsey has this argument. He says basically, three things have to happen before Jesus can come back. The first is that there's a state of Israel. Well, that happened in 1948. The second is that Israel controls Jerusalem. Well, that happened in 1967. And the third is that the temple needs to be rebuilt. And there's a particular reason that we probably don't need to go into here why the temple needs to be rebuilt for dispensationalist prophecy to be fulfilled. But that became the next thing on the timeline for millions of people who were reading The Late Great Planet Earth, and then who were reading all the literature surrounding it as well. And so there's been a lot of obviously that's a major geopolitical problem. It's one that actually, this could be another one of those managing issues between Israelis and evangelicals. Is for the most part, though it's changing in recent years, Israelis have had no interest in changing the situation on the Temple Mount. This is sort of the holiest site in Judaism. It's very holy. It's the second holiest site, third holiest site for Islam, and it's very holy for Christians because it's where Jesus, a lot of the Gospels take place, and it's where the temple during the time of Jesus was, and now we just have the western wall of it, which is the holiest site in modern Judaism, and then on top of it is a Muslim mosque and the Dome of the Rock. And so to build anything on top of that, you'd have to actually bulldoze or somehow build around, the third holiest site in Islam, and that's a massive problem. There's been no Israeli government who's actually wanted to do that. It would be basically asking the entire Muslim world to, declare war on you, if not rhetorically, then in reality, and so they've always avoided it. That's changed a little recently because there's such an ideological strain of right-wing Jewish Zionism that's actually being debated now on is it worth it to try to do something there. But evangelicals have been eager to push that process along as soon as possible because they see it as just the natural next thing to happen. So that's been an issue for decades, and it's been one that they've agreed. I mean, obviously, American evangelicals don't have a ton of pull on what happens on the Temple Mount. That's not just part of what evangelicals have any influence over. But they have been influential in helping build up this part of the Israeli Jewish world that is interested in rebuilding the temple. And so there's something called the Temple Mount Foundation, which is located right next to that area, that is run by Orthodox Jews, that is preparing the instruments that would be needed to actually reintroduce sacrifices on some future third temple. They've been doing this for decades as well. But this is sort of on the fringes of the movement. But I think one thing to just keep a track of is how that conversation around the third temple moves closer and closer, or even in a broader sense, what's going to happen on the Temple Mount moves closer and closer to the center of Israeli politics. That's a sign for Christian Zionists that things are moving in the direction that they want them to go.
Was there also some significance to when Donald Trump moved the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem in this kind of dispensational belief system?
There wasn't in a prophetic sense. Like, there's no prophecy that people thought was
Right.
fulfilled by that. It mattered in two ways. One, it was symbolic. So this has been the cause for moving the embassy has not just been a Christian cause. Plenty of American Jews have wanted the embassy to move as well. And it's symbolic sense that basically the United States is recognizing Israel's own declaration of its own capital, which is, they declare it's Jerusalem. And so it's seen as sort of a pro-Israel move in that sense. But in another sense, in a more theological sense for Christians, it's part of this blessings theology. So I see there's a question from Johnny Ninefingers about Genesis 12:3, which is this really important passage for Christian Zionists today, where God tells Abraham, "I will bless those who bless you, and those who curse you, I will curse." And for many Christian Zionists, this is like the passage to understand how God is going to relate to you, and based on how you relate to Israel or the Jewish people. Mm-hmm. So in that passage, Abraham, for Christian Zionists, Abraham is a stand-in for the Jewish people, and the Jewish people are represented today by the state of Israel. So that's how they get to saying, well, it's actually about blessing Israel. And so they think that anything that the U.S. can do to, in a direct way, give aid or protection, diplomatic protection to Israel, or also do moves like move the embassy, sort of symbolic aid or blessing to Israel. These will actually accrue back on the United States. And that could be in some sort of abstract way, like God will continue to bless the United States or something like that. But it also can be pretty literal or like on domestic politics. So one of the big names in this whole scene, and one that was actually when Trump moved the embassy, one of the people who gave one of the prayers at that ceremony in Jerusalem was John Hagee, who's the founder of Christians United for Israel. Oh, He's a megachurch pastor down in Texas. He makes this argument all the time, like in sermons, as the head of Christians United for Israel, that the way to actually win the culture wars in the U.S., the way to get more prayer in schools, the way to get declining abortion rates, whatever the issue is, for him the key is to bless Israel. So he's connecting sort of this foreign policy issue, you could say, to the domestic policy agenda that has been the traditional agenda of conservative Christians. And he's saying there's an absolute connection here. And that actually, one of the reasons why the U.S., from his view, is in such a dire state in terms of lax morals and liberalism and whatever else he's going to name, is because the U.S. has not been sufficiently supportive of Israel. Like, God has not divvied out the full blessing on the U.S. because the U.S. has not been unequivocal in its support for Israel over the years. And I know for some people that can be a crazy claim that the U.S. hasn't been supportive of Israel enough, but Hagee would say there's always more you can do, and he would point to examples where the U.S. hasn't done enough to side with Israel in its struggles. But that is a key part of how Christian Zionism is articulated within sort of an American political sphere, and it links back to this idea that God will bless those who bless Israel, and it's a little more potent in a Pentecostal context where there is already an expectation of very tangible blessing from the Holy Spirit. This is something to go back a bit. Someone like Jerry Falwell, who was like last generation's John Hagee, he was a big name. This is Jerry Falwell Sr., not Junior.
Right,
He's been in the news for other things. But Jerry Falwell Sr. was a independent Baptist pastor who would also invoke Genesis 12:3, but Falwell was more about the curse part of that. So he was all about sort of avoiding the bad things that could happen if you don't support Israel enough. Hagee and other Pentecostals are really about claiming those blessings. Like God will, tangibly. In fact, I've been in events where pastors have actually basically given like a 90-day guarantee that like God will do something in your life in the next 3 months if you give money to Israel. And so that type of discourse in evangelical Christianity tends to be on the more prosperity theology, Pentecostal side of things. And that's where Christian Zionism is the most popular these days. John Hagee comes out of that world. Christians United for Israel, their entire board comes out of that prosperity theology, blessings theology world. And then globally, Christian Zionism is a very big movement. It's much bigger than the United States, and almost all of it comes out of the charismatic Pentecostal wing of Christianity, and it's tied to this way of talking about Israel and accruing blessings, both individually and for whatever nation you happen to be a part of.
This is where Jewish friends that I talk to come to a rub of, oh, you're saying Abraham is now Israel, and they're like, no, Abraham is the Jewish people, and so it becomes again this sort of dichotomy where, in some ways, then would a Christian Zionist be rooting for Israel to wipe out Gaza now? Would that be a good thing in some ways for Gaza to be driven into the sea and the Palestinians and Israel to take over Gaza?
I mean, you're going to get a lot of diversity within the Christian Zionist world on that. I'd say from the organizing perspective, so from like the leadership of these organizations, over the decades, they've really learned to basically take the cues of the Israeli government and make them their own. There over the decades, there have definitely been, you could say, radicals in the Christian Zionist community who have had very strong opinions on what Israel should be doing. So they should be annexing the West Bank. They should be invading this country or that country. That's always been part of the relationship. But over time, those types of people and that type of rhetoric has been marginalized within the organized Christian Zionist world. And it's become much more collaborative and much more about people, someone like John Hagee, really, I mean, he's very good friends with and has strong communication lines with Israeli leaders. And so he asks, what do you want? What are you looking for? And then he will articulate that in his own way to his community. And that's part of a movement becoming less diffuse and grassroots and becoming more organized and hierarchical, is that they become professionalized. And there's like clear ways. If you think about any lobby in our country, develops in this way, right? Where there's a very clear set of talking points. There's a clear sense of like who's setting the agenda, who's communicating the agenda, who's supposed to respond to the agenda. All that has happened in the last 30 years in Christian Zionism. And so in the current conflict, what someone like John Hagee is arguing for is that the U.S. give as much aid as possible to Israel, and then whatever the Israeli government is saying is their objectives is what Hagee is saying the objectives should be. So as those change, as Israeli objectives change, if they do change, I would imagine seeing the same expectation on the part of Christian Zionists, at least the ones that are sort of clued into the organizations. And that's a real strength to the movement today. It's seen as an asset to the Israeli government, in part because there's such collaboration or parallelism in how they're talking. But that took decades and a sort of multiple generations of leaders to get to that point. And even in the Falwell era, in the 80s and 90s, Jerry Falwell had very strong views on like what should be going on in the Middle East, and they didn't always align with even the right-wing Israeli political leadership. There were often, for example, many of the Christian Zionist leaders in the 90s did not like the Oslo peace process. They thought any type of permanent peace deal that would be giving the Palestinian people a big chunk of their historic land would go against God's wishes for the future of Israel. And obviously the Israeli leadership, at least some of them, including people like Yitzhak Rabin, the prime minister, were interested in the Oslo process. Like, they pursued it. And this became a big talking point or contention point between Christian Zionists in the U.S. and Israeli leadership. And that's actually someone like John Hagee really made a name for himself, because he was willing to say, listen, personally, I don't agree with what the Oslo peace process is like, but ultimately what it means to bless Israel is to bless the Israeli leadership. That was the move he made in the 90s. And that won him a lot of credibility among the Israeli leadership.
If I can interject on that too, I know my parents were very concerned that Israel was making peace with Egypt. And they thought Henry Kissinger was clearly the Antichrist because he was bringing this peace. And you know, so it's a crazy thing that in many ways we're sort of encouraging this anti-peace. Israel making deals for peace is a bad idea that just, I think, doesn't help bring any sort of shalom to that part of the world.
Oh, totally agree. And what's funny, even though, I mean, you're being more historical than I am. You're going back to the 1970s and the Camp David process. I mean, what's interesting there is like who is leading the charge on the Israeli side for that process? That's Menachem Begin, who is the first right-wing prime minister of Israel. And so, so he even got flack from conservative Christians who said, you're taking Israel down a wrong path. But in these cases, what Christian Zionists see is an opportunity to align as closely as they can with the Israeli political class, and that has won them friends over time. And I guess the last thing to say about sort of how are Christian Zionists thinking about the Gaza war right now is it does, there is the Israeli component to this, obviously, but the Israel-Gaza situation fits into a much bigger regional assessment that many Christian Zionists make. And so for many Christian Zionists, the big threat in the Middle East is Iran. And they are the biggest opponent of Israel, and they are the most sort of demonic force in the region. And so they don't really see Gaza as anything but a sort of piece on the chessboard of this bigger regional conflict. I mean, they might, I don't want to give them that little credit. There might be a humanitarian concern to limit loss of life or something like that. But ultimately, the value of Gaza is not even just in the Israel situation. It's in the Middle East situation about this broader conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia and Iran and Israel, and what is going to sort of redound best to Israeli interests and to American interests. And so, I mean, this is unfortunately how a lot of these conflicts go. Is they're seen far less for the humanitarian crisis that they are on the ground, and far more as just another play on the chessboard of geopolitics, and where that means that the actual suffering is secondary, if even considered, because the big thing is sort of, who wins out on this on a sort of diplomatic or geopolitical scale. And I think there's a lot of that going on as well as Americans watch what's happening in Gaza.
Yeah, that actually leads into what I was going to ask next. I've seen, like, you have the Sean Foyts of the world, having Christian Zionists. I don't know if just Christians United for Israel, I think is what he called his counter protests, all the Palestinian protests that are popping up on universities, because he was just at Columbia. People like him. And then literally, like, just yesterday, my mom got a text from a pastor who sent it to his whole church. And like, literally he's saying, like, why are so many young people in colleges like hate Israel right now? Why is there so much anger towards Israel? And like, do they not see what Israel's doing to Palestinians? Like, do you think there's a disconnect on the thousands and thousands of innocent people that have been killed by Israeli government? Or do you think like their ends justify the means. Like this is just part of our belief system. Like in my heart of hearts, I want to believe that they actually care about the innocent life that is lost. But for a lot of these really pro-Israel people that are speaking out right now, I haven't seen any type of mention about, the loss of life in Palestine.
Right. Yeah, I'm just going to qualify it again that there's a diversity of views in the Christian
Right.
Zionist world. I know plenty who, as far as I can tell, do lament the loss of life. Like it's not they're not entirely callous to this, but they see it in a couple different ways. One would be, at least for some of them, would be something about the macro prophetic level, which is there's a lot of death and destruction coming down, so we can't really get hung up on this or that particular.
Blood is going to flow to the bridle of the horses, right? So
right.
There's going to be a lot of people dying for us all to get to heaven.
Right, and that's a very unfortunate way to view any conflict. But I'm sure there's some of that going on. There is also, I mean, this is way beyond Christian Zionism, but there's the echo chamber tribalistic effect that we talk about all across our society, where in Christian Zionist media, I mean, the portrayal of Israel is still even here on May 8th. As the victim of the October 7th attacks. And so what has happened since then is a justified response to a heinous, loss of life and atrocities that were uncalled for. And so I'm channeling their narrative on this. And so there is a sense of like, I mean, I think there's a lot of debate about like proportionality. That's been a long conversation, but for people within this world that are sort of just consuming that type of media, they're just assessing the basic narrative of like what's going on in a much different way, and they're not as morally troubled by the loss of life on the Palestinian side as others are. And I would say that tendency can be on the other side as well, where there's I don't want to just like equate everything, but it depends on sort of, I mean, in a really fundamental way, it depends on like the narrative you've built in your head about who's been wronged and what are the wrong, what justifies those wrongs, or how can those wrongs be rectified. And I think for many Christian Zionists, the wrongs are not just October 7th. They go back way beyond that. They go back to the Holocaust. They go back to Christian anti-Judaism for the last 2,000 years. And so there's a longer context within which they're assessing the Gaza war that for them makes it feel like Israel is still in the right, or at least not in the wrong in what they're doing. And maybe that's one thing I can highlight. I mean, this is something that often isn't the way Christian Zionism is portrayed. We've talked a lot about eschatology here. We've talked about the blessing theology. It's notable to me, and I make this argument in my book, Covenant Brothers, that Christian Zionism as a mass movement is a post-Holocaust movement. Like, it's very clear that one of the things that's going on is a massive reassessment across the Christian world of how Christians have talked about and taught about Jews since Constantine or something, since Christians had power to persecute Jews on a large scale. And there is massive guilt. There is massive sense of like, this is one of the deepest, wrongest parts of Christian history, is the way Christians have treated the people in Christian language that have given us the Hebrew Bible. And you have all types of responses. You have Catholics with Vatican II sort of rejecting the term deicide. You have more mainline Protestants saying we'll never again try to evangelize to the Jewish people. We're going to denounce anti-Semitism. Christian Zionism is one of the evangelical reactions to that. It's one of the ways, and this is framed very explicitly by early Christian Zionist activists, is one thing that's going on here in the 60s, 70s, is that we are finally atoning for our complicity in the Holocaust, in European anti-Semitism. And so when we get to today, many Christian Zionists, and I would put like a John Hagee in this mode, a Robert Jeffress, who's a pastor, another pastor in Texas, who's really prominent pro-Israel advocate. I think for them, they feel like they don't even have the right to criticize Israel. Mm-hmm. That it is still too close to the Holocaust, it is still too close to the history of Christian anti-Judaism to have Christians dictating to a Jewish state, this is what's morally right and this is what's morally wrong, based on my Christian ethical system. And so there's a sort of a blank check given in a way to Israel, and what's sort of behind that check is a blanket apology for Christian anti-Judaism, for anti-Semitism. This is one reason a lot of Christian Zionists are organizing on college campuses now, have sort of organized against the boycott, divest, sanction movement in like U.S. states. They see this all as anti-Semitic, and that their biggest call is to oppose anti-Semitism, which is this demonic force in the world that Christians, in order to bless Israel, are called to oppose. And so they see a lot of what's going on today in that frame, which I'm sure for many viewers, listeners, is not a natural frame to, I mean, there's some of that might resonate. There's definitely a critique of Christian theology that I think most Christians today would embrace at least some version of, about the historic treatment of the Jews and the way that Christians have talked about Jews. But maybe the implications of that are quite unique for Christian Zionists, for evangelicals, in the sense that they take it in this direction that's very political and very sort of, blank check like that feels wrong. But I think a lot of them authentically feel that's what they're coming out of. And so they don't even have the right to critique Israel on this. And their duty is to just support Israel. That's what God would want them to do. That's what God tells them to do in the Bible. And so it's not even part of their moral calculus of what's the lives lost on the ground. That's just not part of the equation for a lot of them.
Or the moral calculus that the Balfour Declaration moved people out of their land that they had in their family for generations to make this nation. And I have Christians who say, well, that's Israel's land. And
Right.
I'm like, it has not always been Israel's land. And you have to have a particular interpretation of what Christians call the Old Testament. So I find Christians aren't even aware that Palestinians, or the people we might call Palestinians now, were actually occupying that land for a long, long time, with lots of families and generations that suddenly got moved out because of a redrawing of a map.
Right. And this is where the tradition of evangelical biblical interpretation on the covenants on the land really just sort of immediately flows into how they assess contemporary events. So, yeah, for many Christians, particularly for Christian Zionists, the status of whose land is the land that borders what is now modern day Israel is never up for debate. Like once it's said in the Bible that this is promised to Abraham and his descendants, that's it. There's no going back on that. Now, many other Christians, most other Christians, have understood that that was part of the covenant that God made with the Jewish people that ultimately is fulfilled in the life and ministry of Jesus, and that the sort of land theology under that is no longer operative. That's not the way Christians should be thinking about the covenant. It's like that there's a particular land or people that are in covenant with God in that way. But that is that's a reading that dispensationalism really does support, that there is that the covenants as made to Abraham in Genesis 12 or 15 or later on, that these continue to be operative, that whatever Jesus came and did not abrogate those covenants, and that ultimately God is actually going to use those covenants to fulfill his ultimate plans. And so the land itself is obviously for them reserved for those reasons. Like so the people that need to be on that land are Israelis or descendants of Abraham, and that there's a particular role that land plays in the prophetic timeline. So yeah, these sort of historic arguments about the last 2,000 years, the different people groups that have found homes on this land, those are all very secondary issues compared to God's covenant, or the reading of God's covenant with the Jewish people around this land. That doesn't mean, by the way, just to give at least some Christian Zionists credit, that doesn't mean that they don't think anyone else can be on the land. It's just that they would need to be a minority community within an Israeli, within a Jewish-led nation state or national entity. So there have been, there are visions from the Christian Zionist side of a peaceful Israel that is not entirely Jewish, that has an Arab minority, but it would be a minority, and it would be a minority both in numbers and in power. That is obviously not sufficient for Palestinians to find their own realization in that. So it's not satisfying the Palestinians, but there is a bigger vision than just a sort of purely ethnic Jewish Israel for most Christian Zionists as well.
What do you think would be, obviously there are a lot of Jewish people today that are, protesting on the side of Palestine and are also calling for Israel, to stop bombing Gaza. What would a Christian Zionist whose motivation is to kind of repent for their role in anti-Semitism historically at the Holocaust and all of that. Like, where do they put Jewish people that are pro-Palestine?
I mean, the simplest way is they largely ignore them.
Yeah.
That doesn't fit in as well. I mean, this is another sort of net of issues of how do Christian Zionists sort of think about Jews and Judaism outside of Israel, just like
Right.
as people. And there's a lot of contradictions and complexity to that. You can even go back to something like Billy Graham and Richard Nixon on the Nixon tapes. These came out actually just a few years ago. Some of them did. That Nixon was a very strong anti-Semite, and he would talk to people about his conspiracy theories and everything else. And one of the people he talked to was Billy Graham. So Billy Graham is on the surface very pro-Israel, very pro-Jewish, very post-Holocaust, sort of apologetic. But when he gets talking to Nixon on the tapes, he's at least affirming. I mean, Nixon's really leading that conversation, but he's like, yes, Mr. President, yes. He's like agreeing with everything. And it's this weird world where there's a strong dichotomy between American Jews and Israeli Jews are sort of strong, masculine, militaristic, and American Jews are effeminate and liberal and trying to undermine Nixon. And then there is a sort of conservative Jewish community that Nixon really likes, but it's not representative of most American Jews. And then Nixon ascribes like sort of anti-Semitic conspiracy language to the progressive Jewish community in the United States. And so this is like the world that a lot of Christian Zionists, though they might not ever articulate it that way, that a lot of these assumptions remain embedded in, you say, in American culture, but certainly in evangelicalism. And so when evangelicals tend to enjoy the company of Israelis because of these stereotypes that are made of them, they're competent militarily, they're settlers, just like Americans moving west, Israelis, sort of settle the land. They seem to be a startup nation. That was a really popular book about a decade ago. Startup nation, that's Israel. Very, competent economically. And at the same time, evangelicals tend to be at odds with American Jews on a whole host of issues, cultural issues. And evangelicals tend to see American Jews as elites, as coastal, as sort of everything they're not.
New World Order people.
Well, it can shade into the conspiracy theory about sort of who's running everything, and so many Christian Zionists would look at an American Jewish student who's protesting Israel and just like categorize them like that and say, like, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just got this like way of viewing the Jewish world that means they're sort of the bad Jews, and there's these other Jews that I really like, and another group of Jews that evangelicals love to get closer with are actually Orthodox Jews. So particularly modern Orthodox Jews is an interesting phenomenon, but there's a certain branch of Orthodox Judaism that is really interested in Christian Zionism, and particularly because many modern Orthodox Jews in Israel are in the West Bank. And so Christian Zionists are one of the few communities in the globe that sees what they're doing as legal and encourages more of it, that actually more Jews should be moving to the West Bank. On paper, Orthodox Jews and evangelical Christians should not be getting along. Like theologically, they are very different. And historically, these traditions have not gotten along. But they've actually done like interfaith dialogue, theological dialogue, and they've moved toward a paradigm where evangelicals see Orthodox Jews as authentic, like maybe the most authentic Jews, because they're keeping to the traditions as they understand them that go back, and that they're the ones who are settling the West Bank. They're the ones who are doing sort of the covenant work that Christian Zionists think is needed. And Orthodox Jews think that Christians are the Gentile supporters that they see as prophesied in the final days to fulfill a fully envisioned national Israel, as Jews understand that fulfillment to happen. And so these are Jews who really believe in biblical prophecy as strongly as evangelicals do, though they have different interpretations because they come out of different traditions. But that's another sort of dynamic that is not really present as much in the U.S. just because the Orthodox community is heavily weighted in Israel. But is really active. And for many evangelicals, when they think of Jews, they're thinking of Israeli Jews and Orthodox Jews, and the ones that are hard to sort of put in a box or to categorize are the vast majority of American Jews. Now, it should go without, or it should be said that most American Jews today still support Israel. So even within the American Jewish community, you could say the majority view is something that is critical of maybe Israeli policy, but largely supportive of the Israeli state or something like that. But there's a growing number, particularly younger American Jews, who are critical of the war and critical of Israeli society more broadly. And that's the category that evangelicals would find to be sort of on their scale, like the least authentically Jewish or something like that, and the hardest to categorize in the way they understand what Judaism should be in the world.
And I started to say pandering, that's probably not a fair word, but the ties to the John Hagees from Israel also benefits them from tourism, right? That's a major part of Israel's economy, are evangelicals coming over to Israel to see the Holy Land.
That's right. And particularly the last couple of years, they've because of COVID and then because of the war, tourism's been way down in Israel. It's one of the biggest sectors of their economy. And yeah, one of the most consistent travelers to Israel are American evangelicals. Now they're not like the majority or anything. They're just a dependable segment of the tourist industry. There are some hundreds of thousands every year that make the trip, and evangelicals tend to be relatively speaking, affluent in terms of global tourism, and they tend to take longer tours because they want to see a lot of the country. They don't just want to hang out in Tel Aviv or something like that. They want to see Nazareth. They want to see the Galilee region. They want to see all of that Jerusalem can offer, and elsewhere, wherever there's a Christian sort of site. And so they tend to spend more time in Israel, which means they're spending more money in Israel as well. And then we know that, at least for some people, though not all, tourism, a tour experience can be very important to establishing a lifelong political interpretation of the area you went to tour. So it's not as simple and straightforward as many would like in any country. Like if someone gives a tour, even if it's a highly political, like ideological tour, it's still like a sort of 50-50 shot if that's actually going to land on the tourists in the way you intended it to as a state. But certainly there's tons of anecdotal stories, and there's more than anecdotal stories of Christians going to Israel, feeling connected to the land, feeling connected to the people, feeling like they're walking on prophetically significant land, and that then informing their politics when they come back. John Hagee, this is how he became interested in Israel, because he took a tour in 1977 and basically had like a second conversion experience, as he'd call it, on the tour. And interestingly enough, the first books he read were about the Holocaust. They weren't about biblical prophecy, but those books sort of created a momentum in his own thinking that led him to pro-Israel advocacy. Jerry Falwell was another person who initially was not in, like, you go back far enough and Falwell said no strong things to say about Israel, but he took a tour in the early 1970s that made him interested in the issue as well. So we have these anecdotal stories of the leadership really caring about Israel after their tours. We also have counterexamples. Jimmy Carter also didn't know much about Israel until he took a tour. He found the treatment of, this was done in the early 70s when he was governor of Georgia. He found the treatment of Arab Israelis and Palestinians abhorrent. And so he came out with a much different view of Israel that then shaped how he dealt with Israel in the Camp David process. So, you can't sort of, people aren't robots, like they tend to take different things from the tours they take, but there's definitely a tie there. And then to tie it back to what you were saying, Paul, there's an economic need here as well. One of the biggest tour events outside of the holy holidays in Israel is something called the Feast of Tabernacles, which is in Jerusalem, which is run by this group called the International Christian Embassy for Jerusalem, which is actually the largest Christian Zionist organization in the world. They have chapters in 90 countries, and they host, in coincidence with a Jewish holiday, a massive sort of pro-Israel Christian fest that brings, at least pre-COVID, brought thousands and thousands of Christians from around the globe to Jerusalem for a week. And there was programming throughout the whole week, and you'd lobby the government and do all types of fun stuff. But that's a really important event for Jerusalem's economy as well. And then not just Jerusalem, because they would end up touring. A lot of them would then end up going on a whole tour after the festivities. But yeah, that's a dynamic there that's important, and it's always on the mind of Israel in particular, being a country that is so dependent on tourist money to have a growing economy.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point you brought up about Jimmy Carter too, and that you had mentioned earlier the much longer history before October 7th of Jewish oppression and anti-Semitism. But then also on the other side, because there's always another side, that there's also a much longer history of Israeli oppression of Palestinians and Arab Israelis that I don't think the Christian Zionist group is aware of.
They might be aware, they might just not find it compelling. I mean, I think, certainly there's a lack of education, but I mean, this is a bigger question about how people perceive Israel. Are they an underdog, or are they an oppressor? Are they being oppressed, or are they an oppressor? And I think for many people, it can seem so obvious what the answer to that question is. But there's plenty of other people who see it the other way, whatever your view is. So yeah, I mean, the idea that Israel is a victim, or it continues to be sort of the oppressed in the Middle East, comes out of a very particular reading of history, and one that excuses a lot of things since the 1967 war in particular. That's when Israel ended up becoming, basically responsible for administering hundreds of thousands and eventually millions of Palestinians, and has done so in an anti-democratic way in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, and elsewhere. But their narrative basically elides that and casts this much longer history of Jewish persecution that does not focus in on that. On the Palestinian side, or a Palestinian-friendly narrative, that is at the center of it. It's 1948. It's the Nakba. It's the disaster of being removed from their homeland, and then it's the unending sort of statelessness and oppression that they've experienced since then. And it's been primarily Israel. I think you could indict other Arab countries as being not very helpful, including like Egypt in the current conflict, but certainly Israel receives the majority of the blame. And so from that side, it's really hard to wrap your head around the idea that Israel is anything but the most powerful military and the most sort of oppressive nation in the region, because the narrative sort of centers around the dispossession that started with the founding of the state of Israel. So,
Dan, if I can jump in on that, because I know we're short on time, but Claude is asking here in the comments on the live feed, do the Palestinians have a legitimate claim to the land, or were they just, as he says here, goat herders that were grazing around while the Jews had been dispersed away from the land?
Oh, I would not describe it like that. So I'm old-fashioned at this point. I still believe in like a two-state solution. I would love a two-state solution. I don't know if I actually believe that it's possible, but I would love that to be the situation, because I think there are credible claims by multiple parties for having that land as part of their homeland. And there's certainly more than Bedouins that we're talking about when we're talking about the Palestinian population pre-1948. There's a long tradition. I mean, one thing to think about is that the Palestinian population that was there in 1948, Israel came in as the latest of a long series of outside entities to control that land. So before Israel, it was the British Empire, from World War I to then. And before that, it was the Ottoman Empire. And if you don't know your Middle East history really well, you might just assume the Ottoman Empire is a Middle East empire like any other. It was a different ethnicity and a different regime than anything in the Arab Middle East. It was today we see Turkey as the successor to the Ottoman Empire. So and the Ottoman Empire controlled that region for basically 300 or 400 years before the British did. And you go back to the Crusades and elsewhere. So there's definitely a version of history where if your family lived in what is now Israel, or Israel-Palestine, it's a long history of outside powers sort of deciding your fate and controlling your destiny in a way that is unjust. And there's plenty of people who can make that claim. There are also Jewish communities that go really deeply back. Like this is sometimes a talking point on the other side. It is not that every Israeli traces back to a late 19th century migration from Europe to Palestine. There has been a Jewish community in Jerusalem going as far back as we know. It's not been large all the time, but it's been there. And so, unfortunately, this is the situation sort of in the modern world. Legitimacy is often decided about, like, can you trace a history back? And so I think both sides, if that's going to be like the way we're going to decide these things, I think both sides have a historical claim. And in an ideal world, that would mean that there would be some type of ability to share or at least live alongside each other. However, that's not where we're at. But I don't think these sort of attempts to undermine the historical claims on either side are really going to get anyone anywhere in terms of actually finding a solution to the problem.
So real quickly, and then I want you to tell people where they can find you if they want to follow your work. Obviously, get your books. Have you found any success in kind of conversing with a Christian Zionist? Like, is there anything that can help kind of broaden their idea of understanding of, Israel and Palestine?
Yes, there's definitely. I'm an optimist on this. I think people can. People can. I can learn. So if I can learn, others can learn as well. I think a few ways to think about. I think learning more of the history of the Middle East in general, not just focusing in on the Arab-Israeli conflict, can help give a broader sense of what's going on. And you can even do that from a largely sympathetic from a perspective that isn't entirely anti-Israel as well. So someone that I found his book to be quite good, Walter Russell Mead, who's a largely pro-Israel, Washington, D.C. type person, but it's very nuanced in how he tells the story of Zionism. Wrote a book a couple years ago now called The Ark of the Covenant, and it's a history of America in the Middle East and Zionism. And I think even that's a friendly to Israel perspective. You come out of that realizing what a just massive tragedy the 20th century has been for Palestinians and for Jews. I mean, you understand, like, there are deep fissures here that need to be accounted for. But particularly, I guess, for the more skeptical of the Palestinian narrative, you come out realizing there's been massive wrong done. There's been a massive humanitarian disaster that's happened over not just at once, but like over generations, and that whatever a just long-term solution is, it has to somehow address that. So I think there are even friendly to Israel narratives that actually highlight that. I also think the theological underpinnings to a lot of Christian Zionism are not they're not shared even by all evangelicals, and they're definitely things to be discussed. I find it quite interesting that polling shows us that evangelicals under 40 are way less interested in this issue at all in terms of a Christian Zionist perspective. And part of the reason is because the underlying theology, the dispensationalism, among other things, is just not nearly as popular among younger evangelicals. So even the lens they're bringing to the Bible, when they read Genesis 12:3, they're not immediately thinking about politics and pro-Israel support. They're thinking about it in some other way. And so I find a lot of interesting sort of data on younger evangelicals that says maybe some current Christian Zionists have very little interest in changing their minds. But it does seem to be generationally that there is a shifting happening. And that will also have massive downstream effects in 20 or 30 years from now about the Christian Zionist movement. Like if there are very few Christian Zionists under the age of 40 now, that means there will be very few Christian Zionists under the age of 70, 30 years from now. And then they don't really have a movement. You have a sort of, I don't know, like
a small group.
Like a civic retirement society or something like that. And of course, those trends could change. Nothing is fixed, but there's certainly a sense that there's going to be a generational shift. And this is, by the way, something that Christian Zionists talk a lot about amongst themselves, is why aren't young people nearly as interested in this cause as their parents have been? And so I find a little hope there that there will be a new, it might lag behind the polling for a while, but that ultimately there will be a new sort of priority list, and that Christian Zionism will be lower on the priority list.
And I guess that would be tied to the shrinking Christianity of younger generations in America.
That's true too. But even among self-identified evangelicals, like Gen Z evangelicals, it's still lower. So it's not just that Christianity is shrinking; it's that this position within evangelicalism is also shrinking.
I wonder if part of that is I feel like fewer and fewer younger evangelicals even believe in the rapture,
right,
anymore.
That the polling shows that you're right on. I mean, that my other book is called The Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism, and fall, I try to nuance that because it's obviously around us a lot, but there is definitely, in terms of the theology, there's a lot of pop culture stuff that's very dispensationalist. In terms of the theology, there are not many seminaries that even teach pastors the rapture idea anymore. You can count them on two hands, basically, of any significant size. And so if that's happening, then that's filtering down to the church level. And like this teaching, there's plenty of other problematic teachings, by the way, that are being taught. So it's not like a decline of the rapture just means we're all good to go. But there's definitely a decline in the teaching of the rapture at the church level, which means that fewer young people are being sort of indoctrinated into the faith, indoctrinated in the good way into the faith, with that type of belief. And so, the things that come from that, the reading of Israel behind a lot of the prophecies and all that kind of stuff also falls away, meaning that there's just less built-in audience for Christian Zionism, at least in the United States. As I mentioned before, globally, it's a different story, and it's much more about the Pentecostal charismatic world. And that's a whole different set of issues. But in the U.S. situation, the decline of dispensationalism will mean that there's a decline in interest in Israel as well.
Well, I know we have to let you go for your time, but it's such a complex issue, geopolitical and theological. But it seems to me like we ought to be able just to come to a human space. And for Christians, Jesus said, love your neighbor. And when asked, who's my neighbor, he told the story of the Good Samaritan. So it seems to me that Jesus would say, hey, Palestinians matter too. No matter what your theology, they matter too. And I just hope people can find a human space in this rather than just political or theological.
Amen.
Yeah. Amen. Dan, tell everyone where they can find more about you, or if they want to follow your work, get your book, all the things. Sure.
So I run something called the Lumen Center. It's just starting. So that's the lumencenter.org. I have a website, DanielGHummel.com, that I keep up to date with whatever I'm writing. I write, periodically about this issue of Christian Zionism and other stuff around theology and evangelicalism. So, I think DanielGHummel.com would be the easiest place to go.
Awesome. I'll put that in the show notes as well when this goes to podcast. So thank you so much, Dan, for your insights. This has been a very, I think the history of a relevant topic is so important because history tends to repeat itself and we can learn from the past.
Well, as a historian, I agree. So
really fascinating. Thank you for you. I thought you were going to solve all our issues here, but it's at least we know more about it today.
Thanks for thanks for having me.
Absolutely. All right, everyone. We will be back next week. Follow our socials to find out when.
See you, everybody.